Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for this Unlocking Nature. My name is Diane Umarungu. I work with Share Screen Africa as the project lead. I'm based here in Rwanda, and I'm absolutely honored to be a host tonight. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to run you through the schedule for this evening. Shortly, we'll begin with a presentation that is going to be given by our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Guy Midgley. That will be followed by a Q&A session. And afterwards, I will open the mic for you to ask questions directly. But meanwhile, please feel free to write your question in the chat sessions throughout the presentation. We are privileged to have a distinguished guest called Professor Guy Midgley. I will apologize if I pronounce his name wrong, incorrectly, but Professor Guy Midgley is a fascinating with nature, was kindred during his formative years that he spent in the Southern Cape. This instilled love for him for the environment. He's currently the director of Western Bush University School of Climate Studies and is an internationally recognized researcher, the leader in ecology and climate change. Recently was elected amongst the world's 200 most influential climate change scientists by Thomson Reuters. He is also currently the vice president of the JRS Biodiversity Foundation, a US founder of African biodiversity informatic research that was towards a $50 million endowment. Professor Guy initiated a groundbreaking studies on CO2 effects on plant growth when the BRI transitioned to become the SAA National Biodiversity Institute. His research contributed to the influence from ecological science on South Africa's stance on climate change negotiation and reinforced SANBA's position as a leading institution driving climate-related agendas. Through his distinguished career, Professor Guy Midgley, he has been instrumental in spearheading global dialogue about climate change and biodiversity, and has made a substantial contribution to our understanding of ecosystem response to the environmental challenges. As you understand, this bio captures very well how Professor Guy Midgley's remarkable evolution from being inspired by nature as a child to becoming a prominent figure shaping a worldwide conversation around ecology and climate change. It has also highlighted him not only as a accomplished scholar, but also a visionary leader who has played a pivotal role in advancing and comprehension of the role of human species in our planet's ecosystem. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I must warn you that Professor Guy, his knowledge on this subject is so deep that if you ask him a question about climate, he might just give you an answer that is going to take us back in the time of dinosaur. But whereas he promised that he's going to keep his explanation rooted to the present. And join me, without further ado, join me to please welcome Professor Guy Midgley, who is going to help us to understand better what happens next as we warm our global climate.
Thanks, Diane. Thanks very much for the kind introduction. And also thanks for the invitation to speak to what is really a very illustrious audience. It's quite daunting. But I relish the challenge, and I really, really look forward to our discussion. As someone who's been working in the area of climate change and biodiversity since the late 1980s and focused in Africa, it's a real pleasure to share these ideas with an audience that is rooted in and or very interested in Africa and its biodiversity and how climate change may affect it. Or not. The ideas I'm going to share with you individually are generally not my own, as is the case in most science. But what I want to do is to bring together a range of ideas from multiple disciplines and create a synthesis of sorts to which I think I can claim a certain ownership. So I look forward to doing that, and I would value your views on it. I'm going to focus on biodiversity, including humans, a very critical element of biodiversity. And let's tell the story. Well, let's start at the beginning and think about our species. The birth of modern humans is essentially in the Ice Age. Our species was born in the Ice Age, in the Pleistocene. Our ancestors, ancestral Homo species, emerged during a time when the planet was cooling, drying, and in many ways becoming less productive. So our species is extremely young. We, as a species, are fewer than a few 100,000 years old, which is yesterday in geological time, our birth. We're young enough for us to be able to even find the footprints from some of our earliest, the earliest versions of the modern species, as you can see on the right-hand side there. And we're young enough to be able to drill down deep into ice cores at the ice caps of Greenland and in the Antarctic, and to sample air that humans never breathed because we didn't exist. That is how young we are. There are parts of the world that are completely untouched by humans. And in fact, it is these ice cores which have given us incredible insight into the history of our species and where we come from. And I have to say that discussions about climate change are remarkably ignorant of this deep history. If you want to know the future, you've got to know the past. Don't fool yourself. You've got to know it. Otherwise, you are working with one hand tied behind your back. So let me help. And I'm sure some of you already know these stories, but let me add some value to those of you who may know the story very well. If we do drill down into ice cores, we can get back almost 1 million years in time. These ice cores are time machines. And here, one of the deepest ice cores takes us back 800,000 years. And if we look at what the climate was like during this time period, it's a time period called the Pleistocene epoch, which dates back to about 2.6 million years ago. And what we find is that if the past is on the left, the present is on the right of your screen, you can see that atmospheric temperature and atmospheric CO2 concentrations fluctuated by quite a bit. Atmospheric temperature by roughly 10 degrees in the Antarctic, and CO2 by about between 180 and 280 parts per million, so about 100 parts per million. And we now understand extremely well what drives these changes. They partially interact with one another, as is obvious, because CO2 is a powerful greenhouse gas, not the only one. But these are driven by the way that the Earth orbits around the sun, its tilt, its wobble, and the shape of the orbit. I'm not going to go into details. Essentially, the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere is so low that those small changes in incoming energy are enough to start to shift the temperature of the climate through interacting with the global carbon cycle, the global hydrological cycle. And this is what gives us this pattern, this pseudo-cyclical pattern of warming and cooling. Homo sapiens has its origins somewhere between 300 and 200,000 years ago, probably closer to the 350,000 years ago. It depends on how you interpret the archaeological record. And you should be asking yourself a question. Modern humans have been on this planet for 300,000 years. Why did it take us so long to become modern people? we existed during this time basically on the edge of extinction in small bands, hunter-gatherers, under enormous environmental pressure. And why did it take us so long to become a dominant species on the planet? What flicked the switch to make us become the most invasive species in the history of the world? We are so invasive that we are now considering expanding to Mars. We want to invade the solar system. That is how invasive humans are. Original Africans colonized the world from about 70,000 years ago in the first wave of colonization by humans into the rest of the world. We're a very invasive species. So to answer that question, we need to ask ourselves, well, what did the world look like for most of the glacial? Let's and we've got a fairly good idea. If we go back to the last glacial maximum, which is about 18,000 years ago, it sounds like a long time ago, but in a geological time, that's the blink of an eye. What did the world look like 18,000 years ago versus what does it look like now? And I want to show that to you in relation to the CO2 record of the planet. So let us see the reasonably warm world of today. I'm not going to say it's a hot world. It's a less cool, less cold world of today in red here represents this time. And you can see that it's a minority of the Pleistocene which has this kind of a climate. We, as modern humans, think that this is the world as it is. It's really not. If we go back for the last 2.6 million years, the status quo is this world. A cold world, a dry world, an arid world, a world in which tropical forests have contracted to a fraction of their current extent, in which the deserts of the world have expanded. This is the world in which our ancestors had to scrabble a living. It's a carbon-constrained world. It's a world of very, very low carbon availability. Small wonder that we as humans are able to generate the only macro element in our body is carbohydrate. We don't have to eat carbohydrate. We can create carbohydrate ourselves through gluconeogenesis. Protein and fat we have to eat. And that gives you a massive clue as to the carbon constraint that our species suffered or evolved under for most of its existence. It's very interesting. Carbon constrained world, a low production world. But something changed. Something flipped the switch. So what happens when the world warms and CO2 rises? The forests expand. Why? What's actually going on? Well, there are very, very few experiments done around the world on glacial CO2 levels and tree growth. And I think South African scientists have probably worked together on more species than the rest of the physiologists of the world put together. But sadly not on forest species, but on savanna species. And this work was done by my colleague, Barney Hoppe, who's now senior at the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. But Barney's work showed that if you grow savanna trees, nitrogen-fixing savanna trees at low CO2 of the glacial times and CO2 of current times, you get a massive increase in woody plant growth and in tree growth. And this is hugely important in driving the greater production of the world's ecosystems and the reemergence of forests into these more arid landscapes. This is a very, very significant effect. You're basically creating plants which are much more resilient to disturbance. But it's not only the trees that respond, it's also grasses and the cereal crops that we now utilize. And I want to show you how important this rise in CO2 may have been to the emergence of modern agriculture. Because if we look at the response ratio of wheat yield, we find that under the cold, low CO2 conditions of the Pleistocene, wheat yield is suppressed by 50 to 80% relative to today. 50 to 80%. It made 0 sense to be a farmer in the Pleistocene. No sense whatsoever. Well, in the glacial times. Small wonder that we were forced to be hunter-gatherers, because this was a no-brainer. As CO2 rose, though, we can see that wheat production rises very, very sharply. It's very sensitive at these initial stages of CO2 increase. And that would suggest that this could have been one of the switches that switched on human development. Does it tie in with the evidence from archaeology? Well, if you look at it, it really does. This is the emergence of sickle blades in the Natufian cultures of the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, and the history of intense cultivation coming into our current epoch called the Holocene. And you see that if we look at the CO2 concentrations of cold world, glacial world, and now the interglacial of our modern world that we've become used to, we can see that it's enough to make agriculture a going concern. And this, to my mind, is very, very likely a strong driver, if not the main driver, behind the evolution of modern human agriculture, which dates to only a few thousand years ago, probably explaining things like wheat allergies and things like that, because we've only been eating these plants for a few thousand years. And this beautiful work by Mayday et al. Shows the relationship between ourselves and cereal crops, and then sickle culture, sickle stone tools. So this is how we've evolved as a modern species. Our modern cultures, the generation of excess agricultural product, the invention of money, the invention of value, the rise of city-states, and our modern cultures have all really flown from this strong dependence of human agriculture on CO2 and climate. What does a human niche look like? And I told you I wanted to speak about humans as a species as well as biodiversity more broadly. And so let's look at where humans occur on the planet and what our niche is. What do we need to do? Well, we've got to look at all the space, all the terrestrial space available on the planet in a temperature and a rainfall map of the world. This is a map of the world in terms of temperature, rainfall, and where the most space is in dark red. Interestingly, you can plot onto the same set of axes soil fertility and vegetation productivity. Vegetation productivity driven mainly by rainfall and temperature, and soil fertility highest where rainfall is low because there's less leaching. So you get an interesting situation. Where did humans evolve? So that's the available niche for potential humanity. That's a soil fertility map. That's an NPP map. And you find an interesting space between these two where the rainfall is comfortable, the temperature is comfortable, and it's a space that's poised between soil fertility and rainfall-derived productivity. And it turns out that that's where we sit as a species. So the humans of 500 years ago, in other words, agriculture without very significant advanced technology, was found in this particular space, poised between those two limitations. The story of agriculture is set by this pattern. And we can see that 6,000 years ago, it was even more constrained. And today, that space has expanded somewhat into these low nutrient but high rainfall soils, driven by what? Fertilization. So modern agriculture is a story of fertilization and irrigation, which has allowed us somewhat to expand our niche. And you can see that our niche, our climate niche, is related to the niche of our crops, our livestock, and you can see that the result is that our GDP is always is somewhat related to this as well, although GDP's, well, we can talk about that. That's another story. So what we've seen through modern agriculture is the extension of the human niche into new areas, presumably driven mainly by fertilization, being able to fertilize nutrient-poor soils. Now, what happened during the Holocene? We see that modern agriculture evolved during a period called the thermal optimum of the Holocene. And interestingly enough, the world started to cool again, although we've had a very, very stable climate. So because the climate has been so stable for so long, it's allowed us to evolve these modern technologies. But the world started to cool. And I call it the Holocene conundrum, because this shouldn't really be an epoch. We call it an epoch, but it's really nothing but part of the Pleistocene. We were living in an ice age. We were still living in an ice age up till about 30 or 40 years ago. And the fact that we call this the Holocene is a conundrum, because it takes our attention away from the fact that we're warming the world out of an ice age. And it's a much more fundamental shift than you might think. But let's look at that. So if we look back over the last interglacials, we've had many interglacials that match the Holocene. So why do we call it the Holocene? It's our narcissism. It's because we're dominant on the planet now. That's why we call it the Holocene. But it's really not. We're still in the Pleistocene. We were still in the Pleistocene. So what happened? Well, the world was cooling down, as I said. And, we discovered language, we discovered fire, we discovered all sorts of things. We also uncovered, unwittingly, a way to uncool the planet and to prevent it from heading into another ice age. The invention of agriculture, fossil fuels, allowed us to warm the planet again. And that's what we've done. We've done our own kind of geoengineering. By 2021, we'd warmed it by a degree. And by 2023, nearly 1.5 degrees through emitting these molecules into the atmosphere. We now control the climate to some extent without any, without any real control, just through burning fossil fuels, like a bunch of fossil fools. And we're warming the world out of this ice age, out of a stable climate. This is a very, very significant shift to the planet. We're creating a highly productive, much warmer and less stable climatic setup. How do we know this? Well, if we look at the recent incredible chapter in the IPCC Working Group 2, written by my colleague Pedro Montero, who's in my school as well, and Pep Canadell, a really great Australian scientist who works on carbon, we can see that if we look at the rate of carbon rise in the atmosphere, for millennia, CO2 in the atmosphere was very, very stable. The rate hardly shifted because the carbon cycle was in equilibrium, quasi-equilibrium. And we can see at the dawn of agriculture, well, after the dawn of agriculture, we start to see wobbles in the rate of this CO2 change. And now the rate of increase in CO2 is higher than it's been for millions, tens of millions of years. And this is an incredible shift to our biosphere. We have created a massive carbon imbalance in our atmosphere. Growth rates are higher than for the past 60 million years. And, if we allow someone like a Donald Trump to come into the US presidency yet again, fool me once, fool me again, the whole story. This is the kind of increased rate we could possibly see if all the brakes are released on reducing fossil fuel emissions versus some of these more sensible pathways. Now, that's a very high rate, and it's shifting our planet. But then we can ask ourselves, well, how bad is it? I mean, hasn't the planet had a higher CO2 in the past? Yes, of course it has. And this is where you'll get a denialist telling you, well, the climate's always changed. Why do you have to worry? What you've got to ask is, well, how? How has it changed? Yes, it's changed. Tell me how. Well, let's see. As I said, the last 2.6 million years has been relatively stable and very cold. and that's most of our modern biodiversity in Africa has evolved during that time. We've got to go back about 16 million years before we get to the kinds of levels that, that we already have now. This is an incredible paper by this consortium, and it shows you over the last 50 to 80 million years atmospheric CO2 change. And this time is known as the Eocene, and the world was covered by forests at this time. We'd had no African savannas, no grasslands existed at this time, and it's only into the modern era that we see the evolution of modern African ecosystems. Our CO2 levels today at 420 plus parts per million are already approaching levels that we last saw 16 million years ago, when the world was a very, very different place. So when somebody says, yeah, the climate's always changed, ask them how, and see if they know this, because I can tell you they won't. If the Trumps of the world have their way, we could see CO2 levels going back 30 million years within the space of a century. This is like moving the ecosystem of the planet back in time at the speed of light, and is the most irresponsible and ridiculous idea to have ever hit the world. I think you can see what that might mean. A world that could be 5 degrees warmer, which would mean for Botswana, 7 to 8 degrees warmer, a desert basically. So this incredible shift to our planetary biosphere has created a massive imbalance in the atmospheric carbon load. And this is a really interesting thing to point out. This is a thing that's currently saving us from twice the global warming that we would have had. If we look at how much CO2 has increased in the atmosphere, and we look at how much we've added an equivalent amount of CO2 into the atmosphere by 2014 of 257 ppm. But the CO2 concentration had only increased by that stage to just under 400 ppm. What happened to the other 200 ppm 150 ppm that we'd added? Well, it was taken up by land photosynthesis and plant growth and into the oceans, causing ocean acidification. This is an indication of how out of balance the carbon balance is the carbon budget is. Despite the fact that the oceans are warmer than they've been in tens of thousands of years, they still continue to take up CO2. That shows how much imbalance there is in the atmosphere. Thank goodness, because otherwise the world would be warming even faster. And, you know, we need to be aware of the fact that plant growth and photosynthesis and the fertilization by CO2 is taking up about between 13 and 15 billion tons of carbon between 1981 and 2020, thus saving us from much further warming. Where has the CO2 been taken up? Well, we don't really know. But if we look around the world, theoretically, a lot of it is in the tropics and subtropics, which means African ecosystems. Why is this a risk? Well, remember, I pointed out that rising CO2 leads to the greater growth of trees and woody plants and bush encroachment. And this indeed is something we're seeing across the African continent. Why is that a risk to us? Why shouldn't we be happier with a more productive woody world? Well, the reason is because the best biodiversity in Africa and the most recent biodiversity is not in forests, it's in grasslands and savannas, which are low CO2 open ecosystems that are kept open by fire and by browsers and grazing animals. And we know that this is driven at least partially by CO2, because if we plot the atmospheric CO2 record, we can see that the C4 grasses, the fire-driven ecosystems, the open ecosystems, fire-driven ecosystems, there's charcoal, rise of C4 grasses, the evolution of spinescence, all the African ungulates are all date beyond the Pliocene and into the Miocene, into the Pleistocene. This is when the world became colder, drier, and disturbed by fire and by grazing animals. Look at the rise in spiny plant lineages. they take off well after the Eocene. If we drive our planet back to these conditions, we risk losing all our African biodiversity. The iconic open African savannas are under risk of being lost by natural fertilization and by afforestation. And we know this because we can see greening trends in these very subtropical regions, which are sensitive to CO2. And if we run the models, we can find that our incredible C4 grasslands will be pressed up against into the driest of the dry areas as woody plants take over across the full range of rainfall. And we will return Africa back into a much more forested landscape, and we'll lose massive amounts of biodiversity. It's not only ecosystem structure, but it's biodiversity itself, which has been favored in this part of the world by low CO2 and by dry ecosystems. For example, one of the richest succulent floras in the world is just to my north here on the west, in the succulent Karoo, the west coast of Southern Africa. These lineages, hundreds of species, have all evolved under conditions of the Pleistocene, the cold conditions of the Pleistocene. Look at that evolutionary rate. This is a Pleistocene flora. And this flora is under enormous risk of extinction if we continue to warm the world. The African penguin, its numbers have been declining because of human impact, but also because of warming, because the African penguin is a Pleistocene species. It is an Ice Age species. And this is a really, really important thing to point out. If you model, as we've done, the range of the African penguin and its response to cooler, lower sea level conditions, sea level dropped 18,000 years ago by about 130 meters. If you look at what that does to the coastline of Africa, we can see that the African penguin would have had a completely different set of islands on which to breed. And if you model the African penguin potential numbers at that time, 18,000 years ago, we can get between 10 and 20 million African penguins during glacial times. What I'm trying to point out here is that the planet has a wide range of Pleistocene floras and faunas, which are now under extreme risk of extinction as we warm the world out of an ice age. We're going to lose our ice age species in particular. And there are many of them, and they're very valuable. And I think this is why when we look at models of extinction risk against temperature rise, we get such a range of predictions. The reason is that a lot of these highly sensitive areas where there's a high predicted extinction versus a relatively low temperature rise is these Pleistocene systems, these Pleistocene hotspots. And these are the systems that are under deep risk. And that is why writing a paper like this, which suggests that there's a gradual accelerating risk of extinction from climate change, is wrong, because it ignores all the sensitive areas of the world and it gives the wrong message. This is misleading. What about all these places? Do you not care? Do you not care for the high biodiversity hotspots of the Western Cape? Because it's okay. In the Northern Hemisphere, we'll be fine because we've got lots of resilient fauna and flora. I don't think it's not acceptable. It's really not acceptable. We need to fight this as Africans, folks. It's our flora and fauna that is under risk. Don't let them bulldoze you with bull dust from the Northern Hemisphere. So what's going to happen? Well, I've shown you the different future scenarios that are in prospect. Trump world, Ted Cruz world, versus a more sane world where we turn things around, but it's very late in the day. So we're pretty sure that we're going to have what's going to happen. We're going to go into a period of overshoot, at least. It's going to last maybe decades. And this raises a whole bunch of really ethical questions. How do we respond? If we assume that we're going to overshoot and come back down again, we can save biodiversity. And even if we have to use ex situ biodiversity, which is expensive, and reintroduce, we can do it. Folks, this is what we face here in Africa. We're going to have to start thinking about this. This is a really deep intergenerational ethical question. Because we can save the Pleistocene floras and faunas if we put our minds to it. And we've got to prevent the crazy politicians of the right driving us into this kind of world, Eocene world, because it's going to eliminate so much of the value that in biodiversity in Africa. So that's what's going to happen. Join us. Let's fight this. It's a battle worth fighting. We can save these guys. Thanks for listening, folks.
Thank you so much, Professor Guy. This year has been really very inspiring and very provoking presentation. I believe everyone in the room has enjoyed as much as I did. And hearing from how different contributors to climate change, either agriculture sector, but also keeping in mind other sectors playing a big part to the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. And I want to welcome everyone. We are going to a Q&A session. I want to welcome everyone. If you have a question, you can drop it in the chat box, but also you have also the opportunity to ask your question directly to our guests.
Thanks, Erica.
So you can raise your hand so we can give you the platform for you to ask a question. But meanwhile, let me take the privilege to ask my question as the host for tonight, if you allow me, Professor Guy. Given the significant impacts that you mentioned that agriculture practices, but also even other sectors on climate change, do you believe the current pace and the strength on adaptation efforts that we are implementing, does it meet the damage that is already done? Or what are the measures of implementing effectively that could match the scale and the challenges that we're facing of climate change?
Well, yeah, I think we've got to realize that our planet's very resilient, and there's a lot of biodiversity that is extremely resilient. And we technologically, we've got a lot of ideas, a lot of ability. So within a certain range of warming, we've got many options available. But if we do the wrong things, we take options away. So one of the wrong things is planting trees in open ecosystems in Africa for short-term monetary benefit, but long-term ecological disaster. And this is already well underway, and it's backed by hundreds of millions of euros and dollars. And the siren song of money for carbon. I'm not saying money for carbon isn't a good thing, but it's got to be done correctly. And we are being bulldozed and bull-dusted by certain interest groups to do a rush job on these things. And it's going to take away agricultural options for us, potentially destroy biodiversity, destroy water, hydrological services, and really condemn generations of young Africans to looking after forests that they don't even want. So be very, very careful. We're very clever, but we also fool ourselves. Remember, the easiest person to fool is yourself. And we in Africa, we need to have the technology. Remember, if you look at climate science investment around the world, investment in climate change science, how much comes to Africa? 3%. 3% of global investment in climate change science comes to Africa. This is a climate crime. It's appalling. The continent least responsible and most vulnerable gets a tiny fraction of global funding for climate science. That's why we struggle. Our scientists are virtually invisible on the global stage. It's ridiculous. But hopefully we're starting to turn that around. I see Mike.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Professor Guy. Allow me to welcome Mike to let him unmute his microphone. Then you can ask your question.
Well, thanks, Guy. That's absolutely terrific overview, just what we need. I'm not sure if you've read Julian Cobbing's book, Growth, 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 but he argues, as I have in my some of my publications, that no politicians are capable of turning the situation around, and no group of industrialists, that what we need is a completely new socioeconomic model in order to create the conditions that allow for sustainable living, not only for us, but for the other inhabitants of the planet. Have you read Julian's book?
I haven't, but I will say, Mike, I'm glad you point that out. Growth, growth, growth. Actually, my view on economics is that most economists don't understand money and don't understand how we can reduce our reliance on growth while not losing the ability to generate wealth. And, I don't want to get into deep, modern money theory ideas, but we have this sense that we've got to extract value out of nature in order to continue to grow. It's not necessarily true, and we can invest in sustainable development much more than we currently do. Governments are not constrained. The South African government's not constrained by the need to raise taxes. Governments produce their own money. We print. The rand is created by the Reserve Bank. This idea that government has to tax us to get money, it's ridiculous, because they print the money in the first place. So why do they have to tax us? The role of taxes is to prevent inflation. And once you make that breakthrough and you understand it, and you understand that debt has to exist in order for money in the wealth to exist, the two have to balance each other. That's how you do double accounting. You print money and you create wealth. So I think the economists have let the world down tragically badly. And we've got to start teaching ourselves and the world how to understand how we can create sustainable development through the way money is one of the best things we ever invented as a species, but it's the worst understood thing. And we've got to grow up. But this is a tough road to travel. I can tell you, there are so many economists who just say, no, that's bull dust. But they don't understand it. Anyway, we're getting there. Thanks, Mike.
Now let's have another question from Jeremiah. Can you unmute your mic and ask your question? Jeremiah Machavi, I think.
Yes. Good evening to everyone, and thank you so much for the presentation made by Professor Guy, and it's so informative and educational to me. So I am Jeremiah Machavi, working for South African National Parks, based in Kruger National Park. And my village is just outside the park. So my question, it's about how having had your presentation and other presentations that talk about climate change, how do we translate this scientific terminology about the climate change to ordinary rural Africans who have traditional beliefs? I'll give examples of traditional healers. For example, I'm a social ecologist, so I do work with traditional healers. Sometimes I do ask them, what do you think are the causes of climate change? They do have their own traditional beliefs. They will say, it is because we are no longer following the ancestors' rules. It is because people are throwing rubbish everywhere. We are no longer, appeasing to the gods, and all those sorts of beliefs, as you know. And we have an ordinary person walking in the streets of Soweto or in the streets of, Nelspruit, Bushbuckridge, where I'm coming from. So how do we, simplify the climate change terminology for these people to understand? Because I believe that they are the ones that are most vulnerable and affected by the climate change. Which way can we use to make them understand, the issue of climate change?
Well, let me say,
Yeah.
no, I get your question. Let me say that actually one of the great injustices of climate change is that indigenous and local knowledge loses value with climate change. It's just like losing the Pleistocene flora. You're losing information, species, evolution that evolved under a cooler, more stable climate. It stands to reason that you lose the value of that knowledge becomes less and less relevant in a hotter, less stable and more productive world. So that's unfair, but that's a very that's quite an abstract concept. I mean, there's some pretty intelligent engineers who you can present this evidence to them and they still won't believe you. So yeah. So, but why? And who do you want to convince? Rural people aren't cause the problem. Their carbon footprint's tiny. They're not the problem. You can give very simple messages to people saying, look, you need to this and that. You need to do this and that to ensure your food security. You need to build up your water resilience, etc. And just couch it in terms of extreme events and climate variability. That's enough, I think. I don't think you have to overcomplicate this. We don't have to communicate this message up and down everywhere. Where we got a hit is in the industrialists, the leading politicians, and people who shaping the global development agenda. That's where things have got a hit. We've got to stop idiots like Putin from distracting us by fomenting wars everywhere. Internecine, interreligious violence. We don't have time for that stuff because we're at risk of losing our entire planet. Stop fiddling around with these silly, stuck ideologies. There's one problem facing us, which we've got to handle. And we've got to stop faffing around. We've got to, anyway, I can carry on like that. Sorry, I get a bit worked up about it, but we don't have to communicate to everybody in the same way. And we shouldn't waste time in the wrong areas with the wrong messaging. Get the right messages to the right people and shape it correctly, because you can upset people and you can really undermine their sense of well-being as well. We don't want to create despondency. It's a great question, Jeremiah. I really appreciate it. And contact me. I mean, through JRS, we've also funded Sand Park. So I'd be happy to chat to you anytime.
Thank you so much for your response. Great.
Thank you, Jeremiah, for asking a very interesting question. And I would love to have another more question.
I see Steve Spottiswood and Dick Carr both have their hands up. Steve.
Yes.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much. That's great. This is not my field, really, but thank you firstly for pointing out that the whole tree planting thing is not the solution. I would call it a scam.
It's a scam.
Recently completed reading a book called Donut Economics, where the author,
I have seen this book, yeah.
with huge amounts of references. The book itself is only 71% of the entire thing you get under Kindle. And the author questions a lot of the underlying assumptions and acceptance of of the global economics as we understand it. And the solutions, as you have pointed out, are to handle the social and environmental constraints going outside on the donut. That the internal economics still applies, going right back to Adam Smith, who spoke about some of the limits, and other economists since then. But the whole business of infinite growth from an exponential, the author questions and does not have the answers. But clearly, this is a thing that needs to be operating at levels way below Putin, right down to the local levels in understanding. How to do it, I don't know. My own thrusts are at even a level than that.
Let me give you some hope, Steve. Have you heard of a geographer called, what's his name now? Oh gosh, he's now at Oxford. He used to be at York. Danny Dorling. Danny Dorling.
Yeah.
Read this guy. He's written a book called The Great Slowdown. And what Danny Dorling points out is that, in fact, we've passed peak population growth rate a long time ago. And we're slowing down. Economically, the world is slowing down, except in a few areas. Sub-Saharan Africa is one of them. And this should give us a lot of hope, because we're already well on the way to the great slowdown. But the two things that are still increasing are CO2 and temperature. There's a lag. So the right trends are in place, and our problem is going to be how to cope with a next generation where children aren't replacing adults. And we're seeing big problems here. China, Russia is doing its best to accelerate their slowdown as fast as possible. China is already doomed to demographic collapse. So there's a lot in place that will get us towards sustainability, and that overshoot is well underway. So I think we need to look at reality and not keep showing these exponential increase curves. Look at the rate of increase, not just the absolute pattern of increase, and you'll find out that we're slowing down. Anyway, so hopefully, but I'd love to chat more about that. It's an endless topic. It's fascinating. Danny Dorling.
Well, I think if I may,
a
key to that is to get the acceptance that those beyond the age of 60 that are reasonably fit, and to increase the number of them, are more accepted as active members of the whole economic
fully
systems.
behind that.
Thank you.
I think people in their 60s are gold.
70s as well, please.
And soon I would say 70s, yes, maybe in about 6 years. Yeah. I see Dick. You've got your hand up.
Thanks.
Yes.
And my uncle Mick, who's in his 80s also. Mick Dalton. Yeah. Dick.
Thanks, Guy. First of all, an excellently presented talk and well supported by fantastic graphics. That was really interesting. But the comment I want to make is that I think the picture's even worse than you point out. If one considers the degraded nature of most of our natural pastures and the loss of topsoil due to 100 years or more or so of agricultural mismanagement. And I'm talking about the still natural pastures and the decline of certain species and populations of species into small little islands and communities now, that I think that just erodes our chance of bouncing back at any good fortunate turn that might come up. So I'm just suggesting that maybe we're worse off than what you've already predicted.
Yeah, Dick, I'm not sure. There's a lot of resilient species out in the Karoo, let's say, species with very large ranges. I was on a Middelburg farm a couple of weeks ago, on my way up to the Grassland Society meeting, and working with a farmer who's adopting high intensity grazing with electric fences and things. It's extraordinary how that system can bounce back. Extraordinary. So let's not underestimate the power of nature. And with higher CO2 in the atmosphere, plants are more productive. It's like adding rain, adding CO2. So let's make use of the natural processes that we've got available to establish the settlement, and the peak of the overshoot. But so I'm not despondent at all, given sensible decisions taken now. I do think there's a lot of resilience that we can draw on. Look, there's some things that we're going to really struggle with. Sea level rise that's dialed in is going to cause us a lot of problems a few decades from now. A lot of urban disruption. But we can solve that, I would think, with engineering solutions. And in fact, there's probably a big investment opportunity to be made use of, to relocate and to build new cities and things. Renewable energy is basically going to cost nothing in a decade. That's going to give us another problem. Cheap, unlimited energy, that creates other problems for us, which could be overuse of the environment. But I'm not despondent necessarily, but I hear you, and I do think that looking after soil and looking after ecosystems is absolutely vital, and we should not treat the land lightly. I'm with you on that, 100%. Thank you.
Yes, Professor Guy, allow me for us to move to questions in the chat box. There's an interesting question that we got from Esther. She said that why then push to plant million trees? If not this, then how and what is the solution? People are now opting to electric cars, electric vehicles to reduce carbon emission, but forgot about the mining. They forgot about the mining of tons of lithium that are needed for them, and everything is a balance. How would you respond to that?
Well, there's no perfect solution. But what we've got to try to do is get the economic and the ecological system working more closely in support of one another. Our problem has been that because we're left-brain thinkers, well, the modern world thinks with the left brain, which is immediate gratification, not the right brain, which is the big term, the big picture side of our brain. We've got to move the world back into right brain thinking, which is long-term, big pattern thinking. But so there's no perfect solution. And, our sheer numbers mean that we've got to, we farm the planet. We farm the land. We don't farm the ocean yet. We're still at the hunter-gatherer stage in the oceans, chucking nets out and just indiscriminately catching fish out in the ocean is ridiculous. Imagine doing that on the Serengeti. But anyway, there's no perfect solution, but getting into renewable energy will still retain a lot of our freedoms, but also reduce the fossil fuel impact on the climate. Planting trees isn't a solution. If you even run the simulations, if you planted trillions of trees, you save maybe 0.2 of a degree by 2050 or 2100. It's not a solution. It's a displacement activity. So let's not do that.
We got another one from James, but first of all, he complimented and said, well presented topic, and mentioned that it's so sad that how we're driving CO2 excessively. And his question is that how best can we deal with these issues, especially in Africa, where most of government rely on foreign aid?
Sorry, I didn't quite get that. How? So can you repeat?
Yes, how best can we deal with this issue, especially in Africa where most of governments rely on foreign aid? What natural solution, I believe, can we take or can you advise if government mostly rely on foreign aid?
Well, that's, we shouldn't rely on foreign aid. There's no reason for sub-Saharan Africa to have to rely on foreign aid at all. It's one of the richest regions of the planet in terms of renewable energy, hydro, solar, wind. It's completely ridiculous that sub-Saharan African countries should rely on foreign aid. It's pathetic. What are we doing? I don't get it. There's no reason whatsoever for this region. This is one of the fastest growing, youngest demographic regions of the planet. If we've got pathetic politicians in charge, we'll kick them out. And it's as we did here in South Africa. Well, partially. They managed to wangle it a bit. Yeah? But we need to develop properly for the good of all African people. And if people are corrupt and they're looking after their own interests, well, they should be they should be voted out. That's the solution. It's a political question, and the young people of today need to stand up and get the change that they deserve. You only have the government you deserve.
Okay, thank you. We have another one from my colleague Letitia from Frankfurt side. She asked about what drove the rise of atmospheric CO2 in pre-industrial times.
Beautiful
Was
question.
that sorry?
Beautiful question. Awesome.
Yeah, it has a continuing sentences. Was that enough to increase the size of closed forest and therefore decrease extreme desert?
Yeah, an amazing question. Well, this is the beauty of the history of the carbon cycle and climate. The two run in concert, but it's triggered by changes in solar radiation coming into the planet because of the orbit and the tilt of the planet. This is called Milankovitch cycle theory, and not fully understood, but pretty well understood. So what happens is that the planet has tended towards a low CO2 cold, dry state, because when the air is cold, it is drier. You get a reduction in rainfall, generally. There are some exceptions, but and because the CO2 concentration is so low, the change in radiation can actually make a difference. If CO2 is high enough, Milankovitch cycling goes away. I mean, if we were to push CO2 up to 700 parts per million, we wouldn't get another ice age for hundreds of thousands of years because that change in the orbit is just not enough. There's just so much warmth in the atmosphere that it would resist that change. So when the CO2 is really low, 180 ppm, and the world gets warmer, the oceans start to warm, the land starts to warm, they start to off-gas CO2 and water vapor, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. And the two of those together then set in train a runaway, not a runaway, but a sort of a runaway warming. And then that amplifies the Milankovitch cycle driver. But then it tops out at, if you look at the last 800,000 years, there's a bottom and a top. And that's driven by more productive vegetation, which then sucks CO2 back out again. And the concentration then stabilizes. Then as the cycle drops down again, well, then the world starts to cool. The oceans start to cool. Cooler oceans absorb more CO2, and then you get a slight runaway cooling. And then it drops down to the bottom at 180 ppm, where vegetation becomes essentially unproductive, and the system bottoms out. So it's biology, it's photosynthesis, it's carbon allocation, it's wildfire, it's solar radiation, beautiful, incredible system. this planet of ours, partially self-regulating, but not really. Amazing. Thank you for that question. I love it. It shows a deep desire to understand how this incredible planet of ours works. I see a hand up there in the background. Mark Lottig.
Yes, indeed, with a C. Thank you so much for the presentation. And what you just said made me realize that it might be worthwhile to go even further back, because in some respects, what you have described is basically a journey of decarbonization that is as old as the planet. Because I guess we started off with a CO2-rich atmosphere, and then organisms decarbonized it until we hit the 180, which, if I understand you correctly, and I'm not a biologist, is the bottom threshold. It is essentially there's nowhere to go once you're at 180, because the vegetation becomes unproductive, or at least there's not far to go any longer. So the question is, don't we have to simply face up? And I'm not denying the consequences of putting carbon back into the atmosphere very rapidly. But don't we actually have to face up to the fact that because we're at that low level, any change in the carbon concentration, no matter how small, is going to have profound consequences? And that if I take the perspective of a very long-term perspective for humanity, keeping in mind that we probably have to survive the next 100 years to get there in the first place, but if I take a very long-term perspective, don't we actually have to think in a way that deals with a much more volatile world than we actually believe we live in?
I think it's a great question, and I mean, this is something that I've obviously thought about a lot. Okay, so well, actually, we could drive the world into snowball Earth. There are forms of plants on the planet that can suck the CO2 down to just about zero. And they're called warm season C4 grasses, which have evolved a form of photosynthesis, which is so efficient. If you put a C4 grass in a closed container with a woody plant, it will kill the woody plant by sucking the carbon out of it, because the C4, the woody plant will just respire its CO2 into the atmosphere, and the C4 grass will continue to take it out. So if C4 grasses took over the entire planet, they could potentially drive CO2 lower than 180 ppm and drive the concentration of CO2 below the compensation point of trees. Because, trees got to maintain all its wood and its branches, and so, below about 180 ppm is starting to get a bit close, maybe 150, 140, 120 ppm, trees would cease to exist. That growth form would no longer be viable. So it could go lower, but then the planet would ice. It would turn into ice ball. And what frightens me is some ideas about geoengineering nitrogen fixation into the leaves of cereal crops in order to make them more productive. But what if we then set loose on the world an ecological demon that sucks all the CO2 out of the atmosphere and drives us to an ice ball, an ice world, which has happened, not because of plants, but, well, actually, maybe. So what drove the initial drop in CO2 before complex life had evolved? Well, partially complex life. What was it? We had CO2 in the atmosphere, no oxygen. So we had ultraviolet radiation bombarding the surface of the planet. What was it? What were the organisms? Do you know? Blue-green algae, which still exist on the planet. Cyanobacteria. These are algae, are bacteria, algae, that can both fix nitrogen and fix CO2 and are resistant to ultraviolet radiation. So if you blast blue-green algae with UV, they survive because they did it hundreds of millions of years ago. And those are the first organisms that started to produce oxygen to create an ozone layer, which then set in train a sequence by which the world's CO2 started to drop. Coal was formed, oil was formed, etc. But it hasn't been a secular trend. That this trend has gone up and down. So prior to the Eocene, CO2 was very low. And then we had a snowball Earth. And then etc., etc. So it's not a secular trend, and it's not set in stone. But we have discovered the Goldilocks molecules, CO2, methane. They're under our control now. Why would we be stupid and waste this? It's like discovering fire. Even better. It gives us a way of geoengineering our planet. And yet we stick it in our cars to drive down to the store, to buy something. It's ridiculous. The value of these fuels is incredible in terms of not only fueling development, but also potentially controlling our atmosphere and controlling our atmospheric temperature. We've been geoengineering unwittingly since we even invented agriculture. Methane emissions from rice and the domestication of cattle in Africa may also have played a role in warming the planet 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. There are alternative explanations, but it's on the it's on the cards. Anyway, so I don't think we should say, well, let's just throw up our hands and just accept that we're going to increase CO2. No, man. That's just, it's throwing away an incredible technology. It's like saying, we invented fire, let's just burn the world down. Come on. I think it's not acceptable. But thanks for the question. But I want to more denialist, if there's one out there. It'd be really interesting.
Allow me to read another comment, which also comes along with a question from Simon Naomi. He mentioned that I have always known that tree planting is a cue to global warming, but I'm happy to now I have known it's not, which is the same case as me. And his question is that, yes, his question says that I hope by the end of this meeting, I will have known what needs to be done by single players like us. What could an individual person play part in fighting climate change if tree planting is not a solution? What would you say to that?
Well, look, our problem as individuals is that we're stuck in a system. We have a systemic challenge because our government puts a massive tax on electric cars. I can't buy a bloody electric car. It's too expensive. Because, so when you're stuck in a system, you have to change the system. You can do things, you can recycle, you can cut down on your vehicle emissions and get on a bike and look after your health. And some of us are a bit too old for that. But essentially, we need to use our voices and our collective will through organizations like this to drive systemic change. And I think one of the best things you can do is inform yourself correctly, or as much as you can, about what as close to the truth as you can get, and then bring your voice to the fight. So yeah, I mean, people have got lots of things to worry about other than climate change. So those of us in a privileged position to have the time and to be employed and to be paid to do this, have to do it. But it's a tough question.
Yes, thank you so much. Let's have another question. But I see Johan raised his hand.
Are you going to lasso me?
Prof Midgley, I want to give you your heart's wish, because there's nobody in the chat who is unfortunately we don't seem to find the denialist. So I'm just going to pretend for the hell of it.
Okay.
If I'm that person that says 90% of the scientists are paid by the government and this is where we're going, what's your response?
Well, I told you, Africa gets less than 3%.
Because we received an email like that this morning in response to
please read it. Read it out.
To inviting you. So
I'd love to hear it. I mean, I said to you, Africa gets less than 3% of the climate change funding. So African scientists are not in it for the money. That's for sure. So what's the argument? That so the argument is that climate scientists are creating a little industry that somehow allows them to benefit. Well, if we go and look at the IPCC, do you know that authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are not paid to do that work? They do that work pro bono, in addition to their jobs, the other jobs. So it's a complete and utter misunderstanding of the true situation. But this is a typical way that, the right wing in particular thinks, and it's projection. You're projecting the way that you would behave onto the way that other people are behaving. It's classic projection. You listen to Trump saying, well, these guys, they're going to cheat the election. It's like, no, I'm going to cheat the election. I'm trying to accuse somebody else. It's classic projection. And it's a sign of a guilty conscience. Classic sign of a narcissistic guilty conscience. So yeah, I would have loved for that person to come on the screen, and maybe they've got a good argument. Let's hear it, but I suspect not. And and a carbon tax actually is by far the most effective way to reduce emissions. By far, if you look at global models, carbon tax, a tax on emissions, is the way to use economics to drive reductions and to drive innovation. It's too late for fossil fuel anyway. They're dead. It's dead man walking. The cost of renewables is now so low that listen to a guy called Tony Seba on the cost of batteries. And we don't have to continue to mine lithium forever. We're going to have new sodium batteries pretty soon. So lithium, it's a done deal. The only reason it's taken so long is because the climate tards, the real climate tards from the right wing, have got in the way of faster and better investment into renewables. That's what's really held us back. And they should be put in court for what they've done. They've waged war on the world. And particularly Africa.
Thank you for the answer. I had to give you the opportunity there.
Marvelous. I see Mark is back. You're going to have a second bite of the cherry, Mark?
Well, I will disappoint you because I'm not one of the deniers. I can try to pretend that I'm not as good at it as Johan. Okay. You started talking about humans.
Yeah.
But you sort of didn't finish about talking about humans, because I wondered if you had in your mind the ideal number of humans who could inhabit the planet, given a stable state.
It's at least 10 billion. Probably more.
Stable, the one which is really truly sustainable, because we're running at overshoot of about 160–70%, something of that nature, at least the way that's calculated.
I don't see it. I really don't see it. I mean, half the world's obese. The other half is starving. I don't see it. Look, our biggest risk is the fertilizer dependence of agriculture. And I think that's solvable. The population growth rate is collapsing around the world already. And we're poisoning ourselves in other ways, microplastics, human fertility is dropping. People are getting less interested in having kids because in a pre-industrial society, children are labor. In a post-industrial society, children are very expensive pets. I mean, I'm being very cynical, but that's what happens as societies become developed. There's less and less incentive to produce excess children. But that's going to be our problem, is replacing and getting to a stable demography. I don't think our problem is excess population. Our problem is too little people, too few in many parts of the world. And that is also unsustainable. But that's the next generation's challenge. Well, for some countries, it's already a challenge. You know, look at Germany as an example. Mike.
A simple point, but it's about changing our mindset. You know, in the past, everyone sat back and relaxed in their luxurious homes and relied on game rangers in game reserves in protected areas to do conservation. Now the priorities have changed completely. And, you know, while the work in game reserves is extremely important, effectively everyone is now a conservationist. And every decision we make out of the hundreds of decisions every day needs to take into account how we can, you know, reduce our impact on the environment and reduce the risk of climate change. So people need to realize that we can't depend on others to do it. It's now in our court. Every one of us can make a difference.
Agreed. And actually, there are a lot of ways in which citizens can be scientists through social media, through these incredible networks where people upload pictures of wildlife, of places. You know, the new world has created a lot of opportunity for more collective approaches to these things through citizen science and other efforts. But I guess, you know, the world is always, you know, there are two kinds of people in the world, to my view. Very, very simple. Yeah, the left and the right. What distinguishes the left and the right? It's empathy versus sociopathy. And these are the two fundamental axes of the human character. The desire to look after yourself versus the desire to care for the collective. And they find their expression in the left and the right of political parties. You know, Stephen Colbert, the famous political satirist, said, you know, reality has a liberal bias. It's obviously better to be on the left because it's better for everybody, but you'll still find people heading to the right. And yeah, I need my guns, I need my freedom, I need my individuality. We were born in the Ice Age, hunting, defending ourselves. That's in our genes, man. So yeah, how do we come to terms with that? It's very, very interesting. These two conflicting fundamental axes of human character, and we need to. We're not all as tame as we should be. People on the left are more tame than people on the right.
You know what puzzles
we're the tame ape, right? But not fully
what puzzles
tame.
me is that the hyper-connected society that we have at the moment, combining, you know, human brains with the internet, with the metaverse, with the Internet of Things, we've never been more connected than ever before. And potentially we have the tools to solve even the most intractable problem. The reason we can't do it is because the different ideologies around the world, political, religious, and socioeconomic ideologies, are incompatible, and humans seem to be unable to make good decisions on the big issues.
Well, you know, monotheistic religions have had their ups, their positives and negatives. But it's also a deep part of the human psyche. And we're just a species. We're just an animal with a particularly well-developed brain. And we're a very young animal. As I said, we're only a couple of 100,000 years old. We're such a new invention of nature and of biology. It's extraordinary. You think, yeah, that's what we are. This is the planet of the apes, and we're the apes, man. So we're still learning how to tame ourselves into societies. What we've decided is the best way to do this is to have countries. That's where we've settled. Now we're in countries. We have national feelings. We have borders. We're all prisoners in our countries. You can't go across the border without asking the government permission. They give you a passport. So we have accepted voluntarily to be caged within our countries. And that's the sort of quasi semi-stable solution that has been in place since the rise of countries.
The problem is,
I don't know, but that's how we do it, you know.
The problem is we've never lived up to our scientific name, Homo sapiens. We may be intelligent, but we're not very wise.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, no, I agree. We're very superstitious still, very. We're full of superstition, riddled with it.
Yes. Thank you, Mike. As we wrap up to the end, allow me, Professor Guy, to ask you one more last question.
Sure.
What's your say on the adoption of green economy, circular economy, and carbon credit? Do you see them as systems to address climate change? Can they contribute a meaningful impact to addressing the challenges?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was involved in the development of a carbon-based currency called TOCO, which stands for tons of carbon, which originated in the country, and they attempted to go international, but because South Africa's grey listed, they had to take the idea offshore, so sitting in Norway or somewhere, Denmark. But the idea was that you would invest your rands into a TOCO, and that carbon-based currency would be based on a stored ton of carbon. But you could trade with your TOCO, so you could buy stuff with your TOCO, but you would not buy, say, a fossil fuel with your TOCO, but you could buy vegetables or something else. And you know, using those kinds of economic principles, you can very, very quickly drive a highly sustainable economy, I would think. But anyway, it's a pretty interesting idea. And then, you know, the basis of all fiat currencies is the fact that you've got to pay taxes in them. The only reason we trust them is because you've got to ultimately earn them to pay your taxes. And so a carbon-based currency could be used to pay a carbon tax. Anyway, it was a cool idea, and yeah, I think we need more ideas like that. You know, you've got to go to books like The Ministry of the Future by, I can't remember the name of the guy who wrote that, very, very interesting American author, The Ministry of the Future, which came up with a similar sort of idea. But this is where economics is so badly taught around the world, because we've allowed the Carnegie School of profit extraction to drive the world. It's just appalling how we've allowed the economists to drive us in a certain direction, and they think they're so great. The climate scientists get accused of not being able to predict the future. Well, economists can't predict anything about how an economy works. So it's kind of funny. They're paid much more. So, and climate scientists get a much better. Kim Stanley Robinson, there we go. Awesome. Ministry of the Future, read that book. It's great fun. He's around. He's got some lekker talks on YouTube as well, Kim Stanley Robinson. It's been fun. I really enjoy wide-ranging discussion. I'm not an economist, so I'm probably putting my foot in all sorts of traps. But yeah, Mark, you're an MMT guy. Love it. It's a very, very interesting description of how economies work. And I wish our finance minister would understand it, because they don't. Clearly, they don't.
Yes. Thank you so much. We are at the end of
nor does the UK, right? The UK Labour government is busy beggaring their own people through inept economic policy. I can't believe they're doing exactly what the Tories did under post-Gordon Brown. But the self-inflicted pain that these people are doing is astonishing. Anyway, what are you going to do?
Yes. Thank you so much. I believe everyone enjoyed this evening. It was really interesting and a lot to learn, especially learning that planting trees is not the solution to combat climate change. There's a lot that can be done within our communities.
The right trees in the right places. The right trees in the right places.
In the right places.
Reforesting with endemic species, 100%.
Yes, true. Allow me to welcome Chris. He has raised his hand, our CEO, Chris of LCA. The floor is yours.
Hi, Chris. Nice
Hello,
Keelan.
Professor Midgley. Good to meet you, and Diane, thank you. I see we drawing to a close. I thought I'm going to listen to a linear discussion. And this was a 360 discussion. And I never ever thought that we're going to cover all these topics. And one thing I just hope for, because I agree that the world is split in two, and whatever you want to call it, left or right, the haves or the have-nots. Those who have doesn't want to let go their freedom. And those who do not have just need to fight to eat the next day. And I hope that when we overshoot, it's not too far, so that the systemic pressure would get everybody to turn the way we have to turn. I just think that in ourselves as individuals and collectives, we're not there yet. We're not there yet to understand the seriousness of this situation. Nevertheless, I really enjoyed, and for sure, we will stay in touch and definitely plant less trees. Luckily, William Bond has already converted us on that quite a while ago. So thank you so much. And for your enthusiasm. I think that's the most important thing. It's passion that drives you, and we enjoyed. Thank you.
There's no point in being a pessimist.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
The best that can happen is that the future you predicted happens.
Exactly. It becomes self-fulfilling.
What a waste of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Professor Midgley, and thanks, Diane and Johan and everybody who organized this. I quantified, I asked Johan the other day to quantify the cost per presentation like this. And then you look at how many people is behind all of this, and the hours you in person have spent on this, and the preparations, and the people who came in. It's actually mammoth, and in a little way, I think we can collectively make a difference, and we need people with visions. So thanks for that, and to everybody, I wish you a lovely evening, and Diane, well done. We are proud of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Mark, also for your support. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Yes, I don't know, Professor Guy, if you have a last message to all of us as we call it to an end.
Don't be despondent.
Don't be, okay.
Don't be despondent. Don't be despondent.
Okay,
Thank you, everyone.
Read, talk, have fun. Live your
Okay.
life.
Thank you, everyone. I wish you to
Thank
have a
you.
lovely evening.
Cheers, folks.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.